Right, hello, I wanted to just make a quick video regarding the stuff that's coming out at the moment that Russia might consider using chemical weapons in Ukraine. Now, obviously, I don't know how good the evidence for this is, because in a lot of the media it's just stated that, foreign intelligence agencies all sort of claim they're going to do it, so maybe they have evidence they will, maybe they're making that up, maybe it's a ploy, I don't know. But Russia probably did use chemical weapons in Syria. So, there is a precedent for them using it. Now, some of the things I have seen in the media, not to defend Putin or anything, have been a bit dumb. They basically said things like, oh, Russian troops are carrying gas masks, therefore they're going to use chemical weapons. Nearly every army in the world is standard issue for soldiers to carry respirators or gas masks. Generally, they're just carried in a satchel, with their combat equipment. So like a pouch, sort of thing. That's been pretty much standard since World War II, when it was a standard issue piece of equipment, because obviously the gas mask as we know it today was invented during World War One. So as of World War II going forwards, it was basically standard infantry equipment to carry a gas mask. Now, there's evidence apparently that they're issuing NBC suits to the soldiers, or CBRN suits, but again, I thought that was pretty standard issue. Not that necessarily a soldier would be carrying it around with them at all times, but I certainly imagine, say, in, the infantry fighting vehicles or APCs or anything like that, they'd always have, an NBC suit for each individual soldier stowed in there somewhere. So, that's the stuff where I would say be a bit sceptical of the media claims, at least in regards to Russian soldiers have gas masks, therefore they will use chemical weapons. Now, like I said, if chemical weapons are used, that would be absolutely horrifying, and again, another horrible escalation, especially if used against civilians, because as we sadly know, chemical weapons are a lot more effective against civilians than they are against military personnel. Now, one thing I have heard again in the media that's sort of incorrect is they talk about World War I chemical weapons and assume that's what chemical weapons still are. Sadly, obviously, due to nerve agents and things like that, the death counts would be much, much worse if, you had stuff like sarin or VX used against civilian populations than, say, something like chlorine being used in World War I. So the only humane way, and it's not really even humane, I could see Russia using chemical weapons against the civilian population, things like that, is potentially the use of riot control agents like tear gas, like CSCN, being used against civilian populations to try and either use it in riot control ways in cities they've already captured, against people protesting and being there, or rioting over them being there, or potentially to try and force civilians or soldiers out of hiding places, as in, if they are trying to move into cities, the idea that they'll flood loads of tear gas into a certain area to try and force people out to surrender before, the intense urban combat starts. That's the only way I could see it being used in what we'd consider to even be a humane, sort of, upstanding way, if you want to even look at chemical weapons like that. If, again, like, they use stuff like chlorine or phosgene because it's heavier than air to get into cellars or bomb shelters, or just stuff like nerve agents, then, yeah, that's horrifying, especially if it's mustard gas or lewisite, then that's kind of the way where it just seems to be needless suffering. We know from, was it, it's not Fallujah, was it? There was, I'm afraid I've completely forgotten the name of it. There was a place where Saddam used gas against the Kurds, and killed lots of civilians. Fallujah, maybe, something like that. But anyway, it was one of those horrifying things, because again, the civilians are nowhere near as well trained or equipped to deal with chemical weapons than military personnel are. Now, in terms of NBC equipment, I was pretty shocked to learn that the Russians still massively employ some of the old communist-era rubber suits, even if they're newly produced versions of them. That's still a standard piece of equipment, which seems very, very outdated. In terms of respirators, there's quite a few different ones the Russian army uses, so whether or not they're going to actually be using current issue stuff, or again, if that's been sold off, and then you see Russian soldiers with really, really old equipment, who knows. But in terms of what the civilians might have, or the Ukrainians have, I've seen with Ukrainian soldiers, when I was trying to look this up, a mix of late Soviet era equipment, stuff like, PMK-1s, stuff like that, GP-7s, And I've also seen lots of Ukrainian soldiers wearing various Western masks. You know, so a massive mix of like 40mm NATO masks. So I guess they just have whatever they've been supplied with. I'd hope for the sake of civilians that if some of them are in the old communist era bomb shelters, there might be some CBRN kind of scrubbing stuff in those if they were designed as fallout shelters. You know, at least some sort of filter units built into the air duct sort of thing. And I'd also hope that, you know, although a lot of them have been sold as surplus, maybe they do have shitloads of GP5s and, you know, the other Soviet era masks laying about still, because again, if people are trying to gas me, I would rather have a Soviet era mask, even if the filter and the mask are long since expired, than nothing whatsoever. But again, this should be a red line for at least more sanctions or potentially a lot more military aid flowing into Ukraine. Whether or not some of the Western leaders would do it and, you know, everything else because of the risk of escalation, but I certainly think it would be a stupid escalation on Russia's part to do this. But again, at this point, it does seem like Putin isn't making very smart decisions when it comes to Ukraine, as we've all said before. But would I put it past Putin at this point to use chemical weapons against soldiers or civilians? No. It's definitely an escalation, but I wouldn't put him past him at this point, considering a lot of the other stuff he's done. Would it be very effective? Only against civilians, and I imagine it would just make more and more people very anti-Russian, anti-Putin. So, whichever way you look at it, it's bad. But again, just bear in mind, some of the stuff where the media say, oh, soldiers have been issued a gas mask, that doesn't mean shit. It's more, do we see them moving up chemical munitions to the front line? That would be the more important thing to note. Also, another thing is, regarding NATO Article 5, if they're shelling somewhere in western Ukraine, for example, with chemical munitions, and the wind blows west, would that technically regard, you know, an attack on a NATO country with chemical munitions? Who knows? But let's hope we don't have to find out, you know, the hard way if this is going to play out with chemical weapons. But sadly, I think it might.